we exist in a set of futures and severalty is kind of what we've been calling it. So we as Indigenous people have to respect the sovereignty of people in the future.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Jacquelyn Cardinal, Managing Director of Naheyawin in Edmonton. She is an Indigenous technologist and a fascinating person to speak to. This is a really inspiring conversation. We talk about being and becoming Indigenous. We talk about humanity experiencing an identity crisis. And we ask, what is the goal that we're all shooting for? We talk about privileging our own generation over the future. In other words, this sort of intergenerational discrimination, reconciliation. We even reference Back to the Future as a way to signal us into understanding how we can affect the future from today. Now, if you like this episode, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app that you use. And you can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other. Give me your suggestions, your feedback, and what you think we should do for future episodes, both guests and topics that we should have discussed on this podcast. Okay, Jacquelyn Cardinal, welcome to the program.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're at the High Level Diner, which is such a cool place here in Edmonton.
Yes.
And you've been here before. I haven't, but you have a bit of a history with this place.
I do. This is kind of the standard when I was growing up. Hey, Jackie, it's your birthday on Saturday. Where do you want to go? And this was always a place I would go for brunch and breakfast and lots of wonderful conversations. So it's a perfect choice.
Yeah, I like it in a sense because it's a crossroads of Edmonton, and I find that your work with Naheyawin is like being at a crossroads of culture, of people in this city, of people in this country, and of history as well. And I find that this cafe kind of is a parallel to that. So before we get into that whole big conversation, if we even get there, You've got the first question. It's always the same.
Yeah.
So Jacquelyn, what on earth is going on?
Oh, I love that question so much. It's just such a polymath bait. I mean, for me, so I usually consider myself what I call an Indigenous technologist. So I'm really fascinated by this idea of systems, of how we use our social systems to do work, how we use them to navigate the world. And as an Indigenous person, I'm SHEInnovates from Sugar Creek Cree First Nation. I find that really informs the way that I look at the world. And so when I think about what on earth is going on right now, my mind goes to the name that I was given by my grandfather. It's my spiritual name. It's Flying White Eagle. And there's a lot of different stories around that from different cultures. And the one that I found that I resonated with the most is this idea that there are these sacred grandmothers that have existed far in the past. And basically what happened was one of them decided to fly into the future when humanity was kind of at this kind of interesting, I guess, crossroads would be a good way to describe it. And this grandmother decided the way that she would signal to everybody that she was there to remind them of who they are so they could get on the right path, she would transform into a flying white eagle. And she would fly into the future, and she said that she would do this and that she was confident of being able to do this because she told her sisters that stayed behind in the past to sing to her to call her back if she ever got too far. So I think that's a perfect story for me. I think when I'm looking at the world right now, I actually have a hard time thinking about the world as it is, because I am thinking so much about the future. I'm thinking so much of the future as a place for Indigenous people. I really believe that the technologies that are coming to the forefront are going to enable the future to be a much more Indigenous place. And it's this, it's a case of getting there, and it's a case of keeping our indigeneity so that when that future arrives, we can pick it up and continue. In your bio, you say that you are both Jacquelyn Cardinal, Being and Becoming Indigenous. Yes. I love that. Yeah. And I also love that you use this word technology in a way that we often don't expect. I mean, technology is not just social media. It's not just the way that we're recording this conversation with this device here and the headsets that we're wearing.
A board game is also an example of technology. This table is a form of technology. And the systems that you described that we relate to each other through, that we build our economy through, that we employ each other through, but that we have conversation through, language is in a way kind of a form of technology. And to call yourself a technologist is, I think, really on the nose of what we're talking about, even though it might seem surprising at first, because our received notion of technology is, of course, digital and numbers and computers and something that is only accessible to very, very few. But in fact, one of the things that allows human beings to succeed and thrive in this world is that we are all technologists in some way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's I think one of the reasons why I've chosen that word, kind of in one of the ways that I asked to be introduced, because it really helps me begin to not question, but I think that it really kind of smashes immediately out of the gate this idea that Indigenous peoples lived in the past, and that we are historical people, and not that we are here and that we are vibrant, and that, I mean, I believe that we are actually going to be one of the things that gets us through this technological adolescence that we're in right now. And because we have social technologies that actually enable us to take advantage of the diversity is our strength idea. We like to say it, but like, how do we actually navigate that? I think that we've nailed this idea that we're all equal, but that doesn't mean we're all the same. And how do we navigate that? And Indigenous peoples have technologies that we've used for thousands of years to be able to do that. So
yeah, in reading about Naheyawin and about your work, there's this real theme of this work is not just necessary because it's personal. It's necessary because we need to survive globally as a species. And the technologies and the systems and the insight that you offer through Naheyawin is critical for us to overcome these massive obstacles. I'm reading a book, and I've mentioned it in several conversations now, called The Reality Bubble by Zaya Tong. And it's a science book. She's a science journalist, and she's essentially talking about the things that we can't see because they're in our blind spots, the things that we don't know, the things we don't know about the universe, the things we don't know about technology, the things we don't know about social media, and yet they're in front of us every day. And what's interesting about her book is that she essentially says that we're living in a crisis now, obviously with climate change, globalization, even nuclear weapons over the last 70 years. And the only way to overcome that crisis in a way is to understand that we are the only ones who can, and that we're the heroes of this story. That story is so critical, that understanding that this narrative that we're in has to be understood, and we have to place ourselves in it. And I think that's, story is a big part of what you do. Your brother is he director of story? Is that right? He is,
yeah. Yeah, he is. And I mean, I'm so excited that you brought up story so quickly, because I absolutely agree. I think that Canada, and I think maybe humanity actually, and I haven't quite put that together, but I think that Canada in particular is absolutely experiencing an identity crisis, and a very deep one. And I think that this comes from, I mean, you can look back so far and just kind of see us struggling with just trying to differentiate ourselves from the United States as opposed to and Europe, and not really trying to develop an identity that's uniquely all our own. And I think that's where Indigenous peoples really hold that ability for us to grow from the roots that are here. That idea of terra nullius, that the land was empty when people came here, is absolutely not true. And I know we all know that by now. But more than that it's a source of solutions, it's a source of strength, and it's a way that we can really move ahead. And that's, I think, where storytelling is massively important. We need to narrativize ourselves. We need to bring ourselves into context. Hunter, and I called him director of story because he seems to have a story for every situation. And one of the ones that he brought up that I was just like, that totally captures things, was it's a myth. I'm not quite sure if it's Celtic or Gaelic, and I will always mix those two up. But it's one of Merlin, and when he was a young man, and he had basically come back from war, and he was suffering from what we know now as PTSD. And really struggling to operate. And one of his mentors, essentially, to kind of get him on track again, sang him the song of the world. So he sang to him this kind of, telling him this big long story. And then after that, he was essentially healed. And I thought that was so fascinating and so perfect, because it's this idea that story and narrative are so important, and it actually can be a healing process. And And I think that's where, our Mine and Hunter's ability to, and opportunities that we have, and the great honor that we have to be able to write plays and tell stories on a daily basis with our workshops with people locally about Indigenous history and the history of Turtle Island, that's absolutely imperative. And I think people really discount that, especially with when we're in a very scientific world. If it can't be measured, then how can it possibly be valuable, right?
Yeah, and I think we've sort of uncovered recently through whether scholarship or just the public discourse that human beings are at heart storytelling machines. That's how we relate to each other, that's how we relate to ourselves, and that's what makes us human. Is that we're not only able to tell a story, but we're able to share a story with others. In other words, you and I can imagine an idea and then imagine it together.
Yeah.
That it's not something I'm imposing, or maybe I am imposing it upon you, but it's something that we're capable of sharing, and that's what allows us to build these buildings. That's what allows us to have a cafe like this, to have a conversation like this. There are shared understandings that precede everything that we've talked about. And I think that what happens in story is that we sometimes erase certain things out, or we put some things on that may not be true to alter the story. That age-old adage that the victor is the one who writes the history books, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that might be true, but what's also true is that we can rewrite, and we can go back and say, well, that might not have actually happened that way. Mm-hmm. Just what you were saying when, that North America was quote unquote discovered. Yeah. Well, that's not what happened. There was a two-way discovery, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to also mention that today is the 12th anniversary of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Oh, is it?
We're meeting on the 12th anniversary of that.
Oh, wow.
And in reading about that before this conversation, a lot of people talked about the reason that document is and was important is that it's a major milestone of a story, right? That document isn't going to change the world. It may not. It may have limited impact on people's lives in and of itself directly, but the indirect impact of that document is to say, here's where we are in the story. Here's where we are in our story, and this is where we can move from. That we've declared that these are rights that Indigenous peoples hold. Mm-hmm. And I know that you work a lot with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and this whole idea of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously story is at the center of what you do. Do you find that the conflict, that when stories are conflicting, when you have one person and another who share different stories, is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is that just kind of how it goes?
I mean, I think it's exactly how it goes. I think one of the main reasons that Indigenous peoples use the circle, and this is where you'll see my Indigenous technologist background coming out. So we have this social technology called the circle. So if you ever talk with Indigenous people and you're about to try and do something or make a decision, often the Indigenous people will order themselves in a circle and start, going to the left and talking around an issue. And I think that the reason that we use that is because we understand that if we're to build an actual understanding of something, we need to bring everyone around and actually listen to everyone. And that doesn't make one story more true than the other. One metaphor that, again, I'll reference Hunter a lot in this interview, is that, he says that imagine we were all in a circle and we were gathering around a tree. And we wanted to understand what this tree was. And so we would start, I would say what I see from my side of the circle, and then we would go around. Let's say there's 10 people there. By the third or fourth person, I actually can't see what they're seeing, right? They're talking about a different side of the tree that I can't see. And so my trust has to be extended, and they had to be trusting me when I was saying what I saw. And so you keep going around the circle, and then by the time you reach the end, you have an amazing actual multidimensional understanding of what that tree is.
In a way, it's the only way we can see a tree.
Absolutely. So when someone doesn't agree with somebody else, I always imagine it as like, well, what are they seeing that I don't see? Because I don't really buy that people are walking around intentionally, or at least not that many people, walking around intentionally being dishonest. I think that they're coming from a certain perspective, and I think they might be illuminating something that at the very least has a kernel of truth. So when somebody shares and Hunter and I, when we're giving workshops and we're talking with people, we are met with really challenging situations where people are saying, well, what I learned was this, or my dad did this, or this is a story I was told. And can't you see my pain? a lot of the time is that's kind of where it comes from. And I'm just like, absolutely. And I think that that's where, again, Indigenous peoples do have these amazing technologies to be able to say, here's how we can deal with people that have differing perspectives, who have different stories to tell.
There's a concept with the Naheyawin, which is abundance, and that you're welcome because there's a lot to give. And that is so opposite to a lot of the cultural training that we go through, which is that there is scarcity. I mean, one of the bases of economics or most of the humanities in terms of an education is that the world is one of scarcity. There's not enough to go around, or there's certainly not. I mean, there's a quote from another book that I read recently that if all people had the same state of living materially as Americans did, we would have run out of fresh water 15 years ago based purely on the food we eat. Not about how much water we consume, not the industry, just on the food that we eat. We would have run out of fresh water 15 years ago if all 7 billion of us behaved materially like Americans do.
Oh, yeah. I remember that was kind of the first really terrifying, I think it was like 6 or 7. You can like go on, there was this website that you could log into where you basically say like, how long, like, do you take a bath or a shower? And like, how long is your shower? And like, what kind of food do you eat? And like, where do you travel to? Do you go on vacation? And then it basically spits out at the end, if everybody lived like you, how many worlds would we need? And I think that I needed like 6, and I was like horrified.
Wow.
I was so frightened. And I mean, especially, you know, when I was growing up, I grew up in southwest Edmonton. So I didn't grow up on reserve. And honestly, I was actually born in New York. And we moved to Edmonton from Colorado, where my brother was born, when I was like 6. So for all intents and purposes, I am Canadian. But that kind of that growing up very much not among other Indigenous peoples was something that was really challenging for me to deal with, because I kind of feel like I really got the hang of it, a handle on it quite late. So it was around that time I think I was really starting to understand, like, oh, Indigenous peoples are in balance, right? So if I was saying, like, we need 6 worlds if everyone lived like me, just like, you know, it just kind of the beginning, I guess, of the identity crisis of being like, how do I, you know, use a computer, and how do I take showers every day, and everyone has to use 6 worlds. I imagine it's probably, I hope it's better, but I'm actually going to bet that it's worse now, how many worlds people would need if everyone lived like me.
No kidding. But what's the flip side of that is that there's this abundance of knowledge.
Absolutely.
And we know that this is happening, right? There's an abundance of ability to change this situation, right? And I think that so in other words, the world is not just screwed. It might be. Yeah. We might be headed for this cliff edge. But there are technologies out there, like you're talking about, which can equip us to maybe at least stop before we get to the edge, or maybe turn, or maybe build a bridge to the other side. I don't know.
Well, and what I really see this as a call to action for, at least for me, is not how do I, you know, use less water? How do I, you know, try to avoid using electricity? But instead, how do I use these tools that we have? I think in academic circles, it's the master's tools. How do we use these tools to actually develop an alternative so that I can actually live in a more Indigenous way? And I really like Dr. Alfred Tayage and what he talks about what the goal is for Indigenous peoples now, because I think that's something that we all really struggle with, actually. Like, what is the goal that we're all shooting for in our present generation? It's not, I guess, kick all Canadians out of Canada or, you know, all return to the woods, because, again, that's historicizing us. But instead, the goal should be to create a world in which Indigenous people in the future can be more Indigenous than us. So it's actually creating choice.
And that's that becoming Indigenous.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So I am Indigenous, but I am also further becoming Indigenous.
Yeah, it's really interesting because that question of what is the future is so critical. I mean, it goes back to what we first started this conversation with, the past and the future, and building a bridge between the two. But that question of what is the future of the high-level diner, for example, right? Well, clearly 12 years ago they answered that question when the owner of the place sold it to the managers of the restaurant for half the price, half the assessed value, in order for this thing to keep going, right? Someone had a vision for what is the future of this place. The parallel to that is, well, what is my future? Well, my future can be answered by, do I have a retirement fund? Am I raising children? Am I loving them enough so that they'll love me when I'm old, so that they'll take care of me? For example, what is my future? What's the future of Canada? What we often don't ask, it seems to me, in the public discourse is, what is the future of a certain community? So the classic example of Attawapiskat in Ontario, which has a severe water crisis, but also a severe employment issue and a severe suicide rate too. What is the future of Attawapiskat? And what is the future of any particular community or reserve in Canada? And I think that we often don't ask that question enough. We ask, well, what was the past? How can we reconcile with the past? I think reconciliation means also, how can we reconcile for a future? Or a future that we want, a future that we can thrive in, a future where Attawapiskat will thrive, rather than just remain the same. And I think that with Naheyawin, it seems that that's the kind of work that you're doing, is trying to provide for a future and not just a route back in time, or just a stability in the present. But what is the future of something?
Absolutely. And I think, even though I think that we center a lot of our discussion, written material, and the way we frame our work around this idea of reconciliation, which is very much a top of mind for a lot of people. I think when you say, we're running a reconciliation workshop, like, nobody's confused, like, are you talking about the South African reconciliation project? Like, nobody thinks that. Everybody knows you're talking about Indigenous content.
Which, by the way, is a recent paradigm shift for people.
Yeah.
15 years ago, if you'd said reconciliation in Canada, I don't think most people would know what that meant.
No, exactly. And so, like, even though we use that word a lot, it is, and because we are addressing that work, technically we are in line with that. We are in line with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work. Hunter and I, we really actually find that we return again once more to Indigenous tools. The one that I think that we rally around kind of and return to the most is this idea of the Tura Wampum. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
I remember that word in my research.
Oh, wonderful.
But I don't remember what it means.
Okay, great. I get to explain it then. Okay. So the Tura Wampum, it's typically considered the first treaty made between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. So this was 1613. It was between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. So there's this misconception that Indigenous peoples typically don't have a written alphabet or like systems of literacy, and that's actually completely incorrect. One set of literacy that most cultures have is what we call a symbolic literacy. So the Tura Wampum, this belt, is one of these symbols of this agreement that was made between those two groups in 1613, and it really lays out in really stark terms exactly what the relationship would look like. So if you were to imagine basically a belt about 4 inches kind of wide and like several feet long, with a bed of white shells made from the wampum, and then 2 lines of purple beads going kind of horizontally across the belt in a perpendicular fashion. In a parallel fashion. What you see is what they would call the river of life, symbolized with this white background, and then 2 vessels traveling down it together. At no point does it become the one row wampum. It is always the 2 row wampum. So one represents the ship, the Dutch in their ship, and then the other represents the Haudenosaunee in their canoe. And so it's this idea that the goal of the relationship that we're trying to achieve is one that is separated. We are distinct. We are sovereign. We need to have our own independence. But we also are in relationship. And the values in between those two vessels that enable us to do that are these ideas around, and there's many translations, but the one that we use the most is peace, friendship, and understanding. So we are bound together in a way with these ideas, but we are independent. So when we're thinking about what the goal is for Canada, I think often we don't really have a good visual tool to talk about it. But it's this idea that, this is what it should look like. We should consider ourselves as, as often 2 good friends would, a strong friendship. We are separate and we are excited about each other's success and we'll help each other if we need, but we're never going to become, like one homogenous group. And I think that's the challenge. Again, it shows that as a culture, we can deal really well when people agree with us, but if they disagree, if they see a different part of the tree, then we really struggle.
I find that fascinating because there's an image I had as you were talking about, streams or rivers running in parallel. Eventually, all rivers come together in the ocean, right? And there's a way to look at humanity as, in a way, we are all one. And then there's a way in which we're distinct groups, and then there's a way in which we are families, and then there's a way in which we're individuals. And then there's even a way you could say we are divided amongst ourselves. There's my left brain or right brain or however you want to look at it. And I think it's important to understand that in that context, Canada comes at the point before which we merge. Right? Not after which we merge. And that's what makes Canada, for me, a beautiful place, because it's before which we've all become one assimilated group. And that we exist as these parallel streams working to build something quite unique. And I love that image, and I also find it fascinating that recently, because it's 2019, in 1619, there was the first ever slave ship to bring slaves to America. And there was a big write-up in the New York Times about this. And the writer said that this was essentially the real founding of America. The founding myth should begin here in 1619, not in 1776.
Right.
You could say the same about Canada. The real myth might actually begin in 1613, not in 1867 with Confederation, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that if we can understand, as you just described it, it might actually be helpful in the story to see ourselves as part of a stream. Maybe many streams, maybe one of two streams. But that question, too, of sovereignty is so important. And I remember reading Thomas King's book, An Inconvenient Indian, and how he stressed that this is not solvable, ever, until we deal with this question of sovereignty. And if you don't, well, then you're just kicking the can.
Absolutely. And with this relationship that we're kind of aiming for, like, Hunter and I had this kind of moment, and I think it might have actually been mainly driven by me as a fairly melancholic person, I think, at my core. As I remember being really frightened to kind of look into the historical accounts of kind of what we have a very lucky history of some of our great-grandparents and basically our ancestors were signatories of Treaty 8. And were important parts of Treaty 6 as well. And so I was really scared of looking at if there was any kind of account of what they hoped we would be doing now. Because I was really afraid that they're just like, no, basically what I would be doing is wrong. I was really afraid that I would find that there would be this dream that they would have of what their, descendants would be doing, and that I wouldn't be doing that. So I intentionally found that I didn't really look into that history too much because I was scared what I would find. But when I decided to actually go ahead and look, there's nothing there, which I thought was actually very unexpected in terms of what they had hoped for.
Like there was no vision for the future.
There wasn't. There wasn't really. There was, the idea that we would be, there's the Tura Wampum idea, and actually that was a very international affair when the Tura Wampum was made. The relationship between the Haudenosaunee and their ship and the Haudenosaunee and the canoe and the Dutch and their ship. These ideas pop up very similarly in all of our treaties all over Turtle Island. And that's because thousands of emissaries from all over actually came to witness this agreement that was made.
Well, you were talking about how there was no vision for the future in that treaty.
So there wasn't, so beyond kind of this idea that we would be going down the river of life together, there's no real discussion of the end point. There's no discussion of, what rapids we might encounter together in our separate ships and what we would do in those instances and, what it would look like exactly in 200 years or 500 years. And that's really, it was interesting for me in the way that I kind of worked through it with the help of some elders and some other stories as well, is this idea that we exist in a set of futures in severalty is kind of what we've been calling it. So it's this idea that we as Indigenous people have to respect the sovereignty of people in the future, which is really cool for me. It's a different way of kind of working with this idea of sovereignty and independence in a temporal kind of way. So when we think of, what I would hope for my children or my great-grandchildren or, 7 generations is an idea that comes up often, is that you really take care to not think too much about it beyond what can I do in my time to make it so they can be more Indigenous in their time and then trust their decisions. Because that's why I believe that they didn't have a very clear picture painted of what they really hoped we would do with all of the work they were doing. I think a lot about what it must have felt like to be one of the treaty signatories, to be negotiating for an agreement that would last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow with no exit clause. Like, how much pressure must that have felt like?
Yeah. And they were and to be speaking on behalf of an immense amount of people. Yeah. But also you bring up this interesting point about the rights and the responsibilities and the position of future generations, right? We, in our culture today and in our laws, there is no future generation.
Yeah.
There is no future until it's born, literally. And unfortunately, that is not how we are going to ever create a sustainable society. Because we know that there are, well, hopefully in 2050, there are going to be people who are certainly not born yet, living and thriving and working, and maybe more of them than there are of us at that time that are not born yet. Don't they have rights? Shouldn't we be preserving water or air or natural resources or stories in order for them to thrive? Why is our moment in time privileged over any other?
Why is it so important? And like, not to roast any vegetarians, but it's the same idea that I find where it's this, this valuing that some vegetarians have if it's for an ethical reason, that animals are more important than plants. It's like, what right do we have to say what life forms are more important? What is it? How is it our right to say that this strange time that we have on stage is more important than the future of folks that will have their time on stage?
I love how you said that, by the way. Roast vegetarians. Yeah. That was good.
yeah, that is good.
But no, you're right. In 200 years, we have to ask again. If we're going to ask, what is the future of Turtle Island? What is the future of the High Level Diner? What is the future of Jacquelyn Cardinal? What is the future of my children and their children and so forth? What is the future in 200 years going to look at us like?
Yeah.
Right? And I wonder, I've always thought this, but I don't think it's barbaric to have a dog on a leash today, but they will think so.
Yeah.
They must. It's because it's absurd the way we treat other forms of life. And it's absurd how we position ourselves over other forms of life. It's understandable given our history. It's understandable given the way we look at ourselves. But it's understandable how one day we're going to look back and say that you guys were ridiculous.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where I think what is really interesting to note from an Indigenous perspective is that many of our elders have said that one of the reasons that we have ceremonies is to balance out our natural tendencies as human beings. Like, we are more concerned with what's happening right now or in 5 minutes or in an hour than we will about what's going to be happening in 100 years, because that's how we evolved. That's kind of naturally how we're structured. But ceremonies and stories and ways of doing things, protocols, these are things that help us bring ourselves back into balance and remind ourselves that though we might feel as if the next 5 minutes are more important, as if, we're doing a really good job of a strategic plan for 5 years, so long, it's such a long-term plan. That's, 50th of a proper 7-generation actual vision of the future, that we are only looking at like a really, really small piece of what we can actually do. And the way that I explain this to folks, because I think it can get kind of heady, is that it's this idea that, like, I remember when I was watching Back to the Future and how, like, scared everybody was about, like, not messing stuff up in the past.
Right.
And then he goes back to the future and then he can breathe easy. And I always thought that was strange because I'm just like, but we still have that ability to make massive change in the world.
Yes.
With our small actions. Yeah. And I never got that. And I was just like, but he's still, like, but that's still how that's our actions now. Like, how, like, whether or not we speak nicely to somebody, that can make a huge difference in 1,000 years. And I think that if we walked with that kind of knowledge, and that's why I think that, that technology, our ceremonies as Indigenous people, is such a no dumb moment, and it should be. One of the professors at the university, oh my gosh, I just totally dropped his name. But he says that one of the funny things about Indigenous ideas and concepts and worldviews is that it seems very simple on the surface. And then as soon as you start to delve down, you start to see actually how complex these ideas are. Right? So that idea of, like, respect for the future, it seems like such a no-duh kind of like empty thing. But you dig down, it's just like, oh, it's actually quite solid and rooted right down to really solid things.
The same is often true with scientific ideas. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity at the surface is actually quite simple, right? That, for example, time is relative. So I'm going to experience this conversation. It's going to go by very quickly because we're just going back and forth, and before I know it's going to be over.
Yeah.
If I had to sit here and look at a clock, it would take forever. That's relativity. At the very base level, that's relativity.
Yeah.
But you dig down into these concepts and it becomes very complicated. The only way to do that, to understand the complication and to look forward into the future with it, is to study it, to meditate about it, to have a conversation about it. And I think what you're talking about is that a ceremony or a ritual is a way in which we can position ourselves to have a long view of the past and a long view of the future. And I wonder, what is it about a ceremony that allows us to do that, or a ritual? What is it about? Is it a communal aspect? Is it because we're actually in touch with how previous people have done this? Or is it we all have a shared understanding of what the goal is?
I think it's a mix of things. I think first and foremost, it's like purposeful setting aside of time to think about these ideas, about the past, about the future, and outside of just time as well, there's also, lots of sayings that, like, the reason that we dance is so that we can do so for the people that can't. So it's even, ideas about other people that maybe have less privilege than us, or maybe that are sick. And so it's just these little pockets of time we set aside to really be mindful about, again, not what's right in front of our face. So I think it's, anybody that makes time to meditate, to bring themselves into, I am a person sitting in a chair. I am not this to-do list, and a meeting ran over. I am not, like all these things that maybe concern us in that immediate moment. So I think it's as simple as setting aside that time. But I do think it's about bringing together a community of people, other people that value that thing. I very deeply believe that you're the average of the people that you spend the most time with.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you're spending a bunch of time, and you're especially spending this important, this good chunk of time with a bunch of people that are also saying, like, no, you're right, it is important for us to remember the future, to remember our ancestors, to be grateful for the things they gave us, and to walk taller, but to also walk lighter. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what really gives me a lot of energy to move through the day, because I think that if you're really wanting to think deeply about the world, be a problem solver, it sometimes can get to be a really dark place. You can really kind of sink into all of the problems and see how much work there is to be done, and you can get into these kind of bad places, and having these moments where you're remembering why you're doing these things. Where you're thinking about, I am a person in a chair that's trying their best, and my ancestors weren't thinking, don't worry, they weren't thinking about me in specific and hoping I would do certain things, like just, relieve some of the pressure, I think is really, really important.
One theme of this conversation that I wanted to point out was this concept of the future. How do we create the future? How do we build the future? One future that Jacquelyn wants to build is one in which Indigenous people then are more Indigenous than she is today. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about Jacquelyn's career, we talk about story, we talk about her brother Hunter, and we confront a situation in which Jacquelyn was called a hypocrite because she runs a business in Edmonton. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. But what a powerful idea, your description of Back to the Future. Mm-hmm. That in a way, we are all time travelers. We are. Traveling into the future by our decisions now.
And it's a one-way trip.
It is. But we still can reach back into the past to acquire the technology or the knowledge in order to send ourselves out far into the future. I mean, we still read and listen to stories that were told hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. That's incredible.
It's the best. And I mean, that's where I think, I don't know if I would be interested in writing a play for the sake of writing a play to be put up for, some people to see. Which is why when I started working with Hunter on our first play, Lake of the Strangers last year, I found that I was like, this kind of feels rootless almost. It feels like this kind of floofy thing. And this was actually before we actually discovered what the story was going to be. And then we started talking about this idea of myth. Right, of stories that do cultural work, right? Because in Cree culture, we have this idea of which we received from Dr. Wilfred Buck. I believe he's a doctor. If he's not, he definitely should be. Wilfred Buck, he's an astronomer, a Cree astronomer, which first my mind exploded when I heard that there was such a thing because I had no idea.
Right.
But he has this idea of misua. Or infinity. So the way he explained it is that it's this idea that came to us from observing the stars and constellations, and this idea that all of the stories that have ever been exist in the stars. It's kind of where we store them. And then also all the stories that will exist are also in the stars. So it's this idea that all the things that have happened, are happening, or that will happen already exist. So when we think about these stories that have existed in the past, we consider them almost, the reason that we hold on to them for so long and tell them again and again is because they help us, get through hard times. They help us be inspired to try difficult things. They teach us lessons about like courage and selflessness and love and perseverance. And there aren't many people working on creating new myths for our time when that's absolutely necessary. So when we were starting to develop this play, I was very keen on what are the problems we're experiencing now. I love the saying, take your broken heart and make it art. I think it's Carrie Fisher. And this idea of, take what you're struggling with and write through it, work through it, take the little stories and little bits of truth that you've been able to glean from your life and try to compose something honest from your part in the circle and then invite other people around it to look at the thing that you've made.
Well, they say, write what you're afraid of. And I think the reason in part that we say that to deal with what's challenging for us is so that our children don't have to themselves. If we can,
Yes.
not that we don't want our children and grandchildren and future generations to be challenged, but we want to have them be challenged by new and or things that we don't, that in other words, we want our learning to go on. We want our knowledge to go on. And so that we can acquire new, so that we can see just an upward trend, I think, hopefully.
Yeah. No, and I think that was one of the things that really helped me get through a lot of the hardest times when I was growing up. I thought I was, I definitely had depression. And the only thing that honestly helped was logotherapy, of like trying to find the meaning of life. And so, looking into philosophy and reading like Plato and Aristotle, and, it didn't quite dawn on me to look into my own culture until later. But really, Thoreau and like looking at all these philosophical works and being like, oh my God, I'm struggling with things that's literally part of being a human being.
So what do you think it is, the meaning of life?
God.
Let's just go there.
42. I don't.
42.
Yeah. What is the answer?
No, what is the answer? What do you right now for you? What is the meaning of life? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there is a. I mean, I don't know. It's such a. And this is where you can see that like my brain is usually like way off in the future because and not so present. I really believe that a lot of it's storytelling. I think that we're supposed to experience the world as it is and all its beautiful chaos and then try to narrativize ourselves through it and looking back, connect all the dots and make some sense of it and then hopefully pass it on so that the future can, if they experience the same thing, which they will. Everybody feels, like they lose their way. Everybody feels like, they've lost something that they can't get back and they won't be able to recover. And having stories and ways of being able to navigate through that pain, I think is the most important thing you can possibly do.
So I'm going to ask another big question, which has gone on before this, in like it's kind of a theme so far. What is the future? What is the future that you're trying to build? What is the future that you want? And I don't know if we're talking 1,000 years from now or just tomorrow, but if we are time travelers allowed to go forward and alter things with that lesson from Back to the Future, what are we trying to do? What are you trying to do?
I mean, I think that we really haven't as a species tried at all to find ourselves back in balance. I think that that's one of the main differentiators between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, and I think that most of the problems that we experience as contemporary people can be traced back to that lack of really trying to bring ourselves back into balance. So, of course, I'm not at all sure what that looks like, but I know for me, I don't know. I think taking time to come together to tell stories. I think that will always be present. I hope that more people feel that they can tell stories, that their perspective is valuable. I think that we've, and I think it's a positive and a negative. We've really idolized our artists, and we've kind of made them a separate kind of, cast of people that do that work and nobody else does. When I actually think that everybody is a storyteller in their own way. We just don't all believe that we're valuable. Lake of the Strangers was the first thing I'd ever written. I had never, considered myself really an artist, and but then when I really started to root down and be like, well, I am being asked to say something. Better come up with something good to say. How do we do that? So I think the future is a lot of storytelling. I'm really fascinated by this idea of defining home. I think that the way that we think about land is really flawed. I think that oftentimes when we open our workshops with community members, we always ask people to say, their name, introduce themselves, where their family is from, and then where they call home, because that's really, from an Indigenous perspective, the proper way to introduce yourself. Really,
Okay.
you say, your name, what you would like to be called. You say where your family is from, and then you talk about your values of where you feel centered and at peace. And you get really diverse answers. And so I think, and a lot of the time people kind of struggle to answer the question, and I think that's very telling of our place. I think that especially people that know about, that are non-Indigenous and they're aware of history here, there's a sense of guilt now kind of growing about being here.
I would imagine that someone's answer in that context would be different than if they were asked, say, in the comfort of their own home.
Yes.
Like if I say, well, my home is Edmonton, or my home is Calgary, or whatever, I might not say it that way in a workshop which is talking about diversity and inclusion and reconciliation, which is important because my sense of place might change over time and maybe should change over time. If you had to answer that question, which I'm sure you do, what's the answer for you?
And see, this is where actually my answer just changed. So for a long time
Awesome.
It was, I know, right? For a long time my answer was in the River Valley here in Edmonton. I just feel such a sense of, if I had like a bad morning or something and I go for a walk and I'm among the trees and I can't really hear other people and it's just like me and like the earth and green if I'm lucky with our 20 minutes of summer here in Edmonton. Then that's wonderfully centering for me. But I think it changed a couple weeks ago. We actually lost a family member, and we had traveled up north back to our reserve to basically go be with family. And it was actually kind of strange that 2 weeks beforehand we had gone up to actually visit the person who had passed.
Wow.
Specifically, actually, just to go visit them. And I felt a very strong sense that we should go and do that. So we did, even though the meeting I had booked had canceled. So it was really just going up there for that, driving 7 hours to sit for an hour and a half. But sitting there and feeling that sense of rootedness and that sense of wherever I'm standing, there's a chance that somebody that I was related to was standing here thousands of years ago was very strong for me. It was a very, very strong feeling for me, and it made me feel very proud. Because even though, I grew up, far away, I think, from a lot of other, from that place and away from a lot of my family and feeling very separate and definitely experiencing a lot of the negative parts of being an Indigenous person in a non-Indigenous setting, often in junior high. Oh, God. When I felt that way, looking at that part of my heritage and the place where my people are from and, and the poverty and all the things that often come packaged with it, unfortunately, right now. It's hard to feel strength there, but I think now it was the first real time that I was like, no, this is where there are deep roots. And then Hunter and I, because we've been learning a lot more about our family history, we had gone to the cemetery on our reserve.
Wow.
And we fully fangirled there, which is the weirdest. In retrospect, I was like, that was super weird. But we were going to different graves, being like, oh my God, this is this person. They're right here. And so I think that sense of home is that, for me now, is very connected to history. It's very connected to family and where we've come from. And so that would be my answer now for sure.
That's fascinating, and I think that's actually hopefully the purpose of a cemetery, the purpose of this place where we remember those who are no longer with us in person. Mm-hmm. But to fangirl over them, what's wrong with that? That sounds exactly what a grave should be for.
Right. And at the same time, though, because we have a lot of, and there's a total flip side to that, especially in Indigenous communities, where we almost paint over the negative parts or the sick parts of some people that have done amazing things and that are totally worthy of being fangirled over. But we paint over their flaws. And that's something that's also hard on us, because then we're just like, but I'm flawed. So I'm not of these people because I'm flawed, because we've painted over those aspects.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to recognize and appreciate what has come before that was good and not paint over the things that were bad. It doesn't diminish the good by accepting the bad, right? I mean, if we look at, I don't know, you mentioned artists before. Yeah. The artist Caravaggio was a murderer. Yeah. This guy was a bad dude.
Yeah.
And yet, should we just take down his paintings? I mean, there are worse examples of this. I mean, Wagner was an anti-Semite. Whatever. We can look at all kinds of people who did awful things. Does that change the fact that what they created or how they added to our story is no longer valuable? And I don't think it's true. And yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, like, that when you mentioned before, like, I wonder what people will think of us in 200 years. I think about that a lot. I've literally been told a couple times in person that I'm a hypocrite because I'm Indigenous, but I own a business and live downtown in Edmonton.
What?
Yeah, I know.
I don't understand. Why would that make you a
Because I'm
hypocrite?
participating in the system. And I
So
get it.
what should you do instead?
I mean, that's basically where I was. I mean, of course, I like reacted and cried and that kind of stuff. And like, I mean, because it's like literally, I think the worst thing that somebody could say to me in particular.
Yeah.
Because like, I care so much about this part of my identity. And I care so much about about carrying on the journey of my family in a good way, and it matters so much to me. But I completely understand that part of like, our human rights are literally being violated, and our Indigenous rights are literally being violated by me not actually being able to choose to be, like, actually have the choice to go live in a more culturally coherent way without basically putting myself into poverty. Right. So that means it's not truly a choice. And that's what has been identified among like many like brilliant Indigenous thinkers, that's the real problem right now is we need to develop alternatives so that we can, endeavor to live in a more Indigenous way, but not, at the harm of ourselves. Essentially.
Sure. But I also think that life is messy. Right? Like it will always be messy. That's part of the story of being human. I mean, this discussion of cultural appropriation, for example, which we don't need to get into, but some people eat sushi and they have no idea where it's from or what it means. And some people start up a sushi restaurant knowing that they are not Japanese or whatever. Okay, it's just sushi. It's just a way to cut fish. Yeah, there's a lineage to it. But we also live in a world where in 200 years, will we still appreciate that as Japanese? I mean, pizza we think of as Italian. Pizza came from China originally, right? I mean, should we all give? I don't know. To what extent should we change the world as a result of the contradictions which exist? But contradictions it's the human experience.
Oh, absolutely, and that's what you get when you try to see the world in a very black and white way.
Or try to set it as now. This is the world now, and it will always be this way.
Like, there are good things and there are bad things.
Yeah,
and if part of a thing is bad, then that means it's all bad. And it's just very... And I really understand the drive to do that, because, like, the world's a lot simpler that way. I don't know if you feel like this, but I feel like especially more conversations I have with other people and learn more about different things, I find that I feel like I know less about the world. I feel like I understand less. But, like, that feeling of, like, okay, like, the world is a very complicated place. I feel like I don't even have the capacity to judge people anymore, because I feel like if I can't typically understand exactly where somebody's coming from, if I kind of understand and feel like I wouldn't make a different decision had I been in their place, then I feel like I don't understand what they've said.
Right, but in a way, no matter what position you're in, you can always think, and maybe we should think about, how would I do things differently? If I could go back to 1955 and Back to the Future, how would I do things differently to make the past better?
Yeah.
Likewise, if I meet someone who's made some pretty bad choices or some great choices, how would I have acted differently? That's the power of the human imagination. It doesn't mean that I have to judge that person, and it doesn't mean that I have to, charge that person with a crime or just treat that person as less than me. It just means I can learn from that. But things are changing every second of every day. I mean, this question of where is your home, I think philosophically we relate to people depending on context, right? So when I lived abroad in Europe, when someone asked me where I was from, I'd say from Canada, and then they would ask always where in Canada. And if I said Calgary, which is where I had come from, they'd be like, "Oh, okay, whatever. I don't know what that is."
Oh, that's nice.
So I said, "Where the mountains?"
Near Toronto?
It's exactly. Or which coast is that near, or whatever. Or is that an igloo? No, and inevitably I would say it's where the mountains meet the prairies. So that was my identity. My identity became over time where the mountains meet the prairies. I don't say that anymore. But that doesn't make me a hypocrite, because I no longer see myself as coming from the place where the mountains meet the prairies. Now I see myself as coming from a city of 1.2 million people, or however. It's not just the words and the context. There's also a truth of who I'm speaking with and how that might affect what I'm saying, and doesn't make me a hypocrite. I can't possibly be a hypocrite. And I know that's a different order of what happened to you because of the choices that you've made. But it seems to me that how is that person who's saying that to you, how could they possibly have a less messy life?
And I don't think that anybody, I don't even believe that they did think that, right? And that's where, again, it's, we exist in relationship with other people and with places. And I think that idea of the importance of place and where home is, of land, of, how we are connected with this place that we are technically made of, actually, of, we are made of the earth, really. That the fact that we are struggling to identify that now, I think is a huge problem. And I think that that's where, if I had to say, if I could achieve one goal with any of the work that I do at Naheyawin or in any of my other work, it would be that people feel connected to where they live and that they have a respect for it and a love for it and a real joy to be here. Because at the end of the day, because of our treaty relationship, everybody is supposed to be here. It's our job to consistently be trying to bring ourselves back into balance in that treaty relationship. It's not something, as Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, it's not that we broke something. It's not as if we lost something. It's always a case of how do we bring ourselves back into balance? How do we bring ourselves back into relationship? And the thing that ties us together is the places that we live.
Well, and there's no greater utility for that than, say, climate change. When we talk about balance, I mean, you cannot possibly solve this problem or the many other problems that face us globally without a sense of balance or a reestablishing of balance to equilibrium. Jacquelyn, I've got 10 things for you at the end of the conversation. I don't know if you know about this, but
I'm excited.
I've got 10. Some of them are, no, they're all words. No, one of them is 2 words in one.
Okay.
And you can react however you like. Don't look at them.
Oh, sorry.
You can't look at them in advance. You can react emotionally. You can react
with dance.
Intellectually with dance. That's fine. Maybe I'll describe it as you dance. The trick is that brevity is a gift.
Okay.
Brevity is good. Okay, the first one is, and I didn't write these in the I wrote these before. Abundance.
The only way forward.
Canada.
Kanata, a clean and sacred place.
Cool. Reconciliation.
Really challenging.
Do you think that we should strike the part re from that and just say conciliation?
Oh God! And see, that's where I would need to consult my etymology dictionary. And so Naheyawin, when you shorten it, when you actually expand it into the full Cree word Naheyawin, it means the Cree language, because we have a saying in our family that when the people forget, the language remembers. So a lot of our work is linking right back to looking down and breaking down the words that we have, because they are a connection to the past, to the land, to things that happened. So I would love to say that I actually have broken down that word, which would seem like a huge blind spot, actually. I feel like I need to look into it.
Yeah, I love what you just said. When the people forget, the language remembers. That is so true. The fourth one, the circle.
Wow, you did good in picking these out. The most important technology that we have.
Treaty.
Ooh, this is tough, because there's so many things I want to say about it. I think it's the true goal for Canada right now. I think that's what we should all be endeavoring to be, is really taking up that responsibility and recognizing the benefits we have of being treaty people.
Cool. Stranger.
Ooh. So I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is Lake of the Strangers.
Yeah.
So hilariously, so the name of the play actually comes from the name for the Lesser Slave Lake. So it was called Lake of the Strangers, and so the explorer, we'll use that word, Mackenzie, he had basically heard about this place up north, which was Lesser Slave Lake, and had heard the Cree people calling it the Lake of the Strangers. So he called it that. And the funny thing is, the history of that word is that it's supposed to be referring to the Dene, because that's where we first kind of met the Dene, and there's this whole massive interesting story. But my dad says, and a couple of other people have reiterated, that the word, the name for the Lake of the Strangers, is actually, it predates the meeting of the Dene. So it actually is it's not referring to that meeting. So it was known as Lake of the Strangers before that. So it's just kind of so who are the strangers then?
Interesting.
Right?
I think we should name it that again. What
I know.
a great name.
Isn't that cool?
Even without the context of the story, it's just such a good name for a lake.
I know. Yeah, it's where the slavey or the strangers lived.
Yeah. And because lesser slaves, it's like, well, it's the other one.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the lesser. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, next one is Standing Rock.
Ooh. It was a massive teaching moment for me, honestly. I feel like it was the first time I felt as an Indigenous person going on to and trying to be a good ally to other Indigenous peoples, because we're very different, that I was really shown how to welcome allies in from a personal experience. So I was really able to, I felt really welcomed in. And it was where I first heard that idea that we are not protecting the earth, we are the earth protecting herself. And it really helped me think about myself as a part of the land, and that's why it's weird to think about land ownership.
Yeah, like you're an agent of something greater.
Yeah, that you're a part of it.
Globalization.
Very tangled problem and like hugely exciting process at the same time.
Cool. Democracy.
I think I could probably call, I don't know. That's so tough. I mean, at the same time, we were kind of forced to adopt a democratic system, and it hasn't worked very well because, well, it's not that it hasn't worked very well. As Indigenous peoples, we are more gynocratic, so having our elders make decisions for us. Again, as I feel like I get older, the more I feel like I feel like I need to let people with more knowledge really make more of the decisions. And I think that populism is a huge problem right now, and so, yeah, it's pretty troubling. I think it's necessary with the amount of people that we have right now, and I hope there's something else that we can use to navigate keeping this system, because I do think it's the best that we have right now.
Yeah, it's the best form of, or the worst form of government except for all the rest.
Yeah, exactly.
As Winston Churchill
oh my
said.
God, that's perfect.
I had a conversation with a guy named Fleming Puckett some weeks ago. That was on this show and he studies the San people of the Kalahari in southern Africa, and he studied and essentially wrote a paper some time ago about how the imposition by colonial power on Indigenous people of institutions and ways of working and systems like democracy, the reaction is usually that they shut down. The reaction is not anger, it's not protest, it's not just complete acceptance and assimilation. It's just, a
resignation.
Shut down. But not just resignation to the system, it's a resignation to everything.
Yeah.
And he cited that as an example in parallel to the experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada who, after the imposition of a lot of these systems, simply went, whatever. And whatever, that word to everything. And it was a very interesting, in a way, social science insight into the reaction to having a word like democracy imposed without really unpacking what that is. I mean, we seem to receive that word democracy as, oh, good. Almost every time I put that word in one of these 10 words, the reaction is, ooh, important, or we must preserve it, or right. There's a definite moral value associated with democracy that isn't necessarily connected to what it actually means and how it's actually practiced. There are many people who say that there is no real democracy on the planet Earth. None of them are democracies. They're elected dictatorships or somewhere on that spectrum, right?
Yeah. No, that totally. I mean, I know just from an Indigenous point of view, and perhaps this is reiterating the conversation that you had, but, that all of our systems are so interconnected that if one is disrupted, it compromises everything else. So it is definitely one of those. And it's at once a strength and in another part a weakness. On my mom's side of the family, I have a really interesting Jewish background. So I have the kind of interesting privilege of being able to look at what happens when you attack the people during the Holocaust versus what happened when you attack the culture.
Right.
And so when you attack the culture, the people take a very, very long time to recover. And I think it is because of the disturbance of these systems. Yeah.
Okay, last one. Privacy.
Extremely important.
Why?
I mean, I certainly consider it a human right. I think that the right to privacy is something that I think it's important for learning, processing. I think that, going back to the word globalization, is that this idea that if we're going to be hyper-connected, and we don't really have I think an important part of being hyper-connected and being in community is the ability to go away and kind of be by yourself. The ability to make mistakes, the ability to have private thoughts and work through things is really, really important. So I actually, with my work with kind of technology, this idea of Indigenous peoples being the largest sub-demographic in Canada that are really taking up Facebook in particular, our privacy is being violated essentially there.
Right.
People don't have that ability to actually own their own information and own their own data. So that's, OCAP principles are really important there. So especially for Indigenous people, not having privacy or ownership of your data has spelled not very good things in the past. So it's something that I think is underemphasized for most people.
Yeah, and I think it's worryingly becoming an old-fashioned idea, as opposed to a critical principle of our time and of our society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a necessary thing. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Jacquelyn, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. This was so wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
To learn more about Jacquelyn Cardinal, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes and a way to get in touch with me to let me know what you think of this episode or any other. Now, your quote of the week is from Wilfred Buck, a Cree astronomer that Jacquelyn mentioned earlier in this conversation, and it goes, "Everybody has their stories about the sky because everybody lives under the sky." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks for this episode to the High Level Diner in Edmonton for giving us the chance to record in their wonderful space.